class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Sharks defensemen and goaltending grades for the Stanley Cup playoffs. So, of course, as with the forwards, I am not going to be taking into account injuries as a factor for my grading. So, obviously, the prime example of that will be Erik Carlson. Yes, I realize he played through a groin injury for the entirety of the playoffs, but that doesn't mean he's going to get a guaranteed A because he played just as well as he could have through that injury. Because, again, I don't know the extent of how it was at different times in the playoffs. It seems like it was worse against the Blues maybe than it was against the Avalanche, or let's say something like that. But I'm not going to take that into account, just the play he put up in the games that he did play. So starting off is Brendan Dillon, probably the most disappointing defenseman of these playoffs for the Sharks, even though someone like Joakim Ryan does exist. Brendan Dillon was potentially the most consistent defender for the Sharks during this season. I've said that before, and I'm now saying it again. You look at Vlasic, who had such inconsistencies through the regular season. Same with Braun. Carlson struggled at the start, then of course was injured for a good chunk of it. Burns, while was fantastic offensively for the majority of the season, did struggle at times defensively. Obviously, Ryan is Ryan. Shemek didn't get to play all too many games, but Brendan Dillon played the full 82 games, if I'm not mistaken. He was very good defensively for the majority of those games, and it was impressive to see for someone like Brendan Dillon, who just 3-4 years ago seemed like a borderline sixth defender and was almost looking like a top 4 guy for the Sharks this season up until these playoffs. Especially considering the fact that Joakim Ryan wasn't going to be relied on to play many minutes. You were hoping Brendan Dillon could get up there in minutes, up near the 20-minute mark. And during the first 6 games of the Golden Knights series, that seemed to be the case. Dillon was averaging close to just about 20 minutes a game. But come Game 7, I don't know if it was an injury or something, but he was on the bench for, I believe, the entirety of it. Even in a game that went close to 80 minutes, Brendan Dillon didn't even hit the 10-minute mark. And then come the Colorado series, he was down a good 3 to 4 minutes a game, getting just about 15, where when you're already running 15 defensemen, that is a bit of a struggle, and I don't blame DeBoer for doing it because Dillon was struggling heavily in the playoffs, the worst plus-minus on the team. It was contributing very, very little offensively, I think with only just a single or maybe a couple of assists during the play, and so a fantastic regular season was spoiled, but a pretty awful postseason, and as such, he gets the worst grade that will end up on this board with the grade of a D. Next is Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who, opposite of Brendan Dillon, probably had the best postseason out of any of the defensemen, in my opinion. Vlasic was just spectacular defensively. In the game, Vlasic played 17 and a half games, I guess you could say. He missed a couple with injury and left one early. And, of course, those games happened to be Game 2, 3, and 4 against the Golden Knights, the worst stretch of games the Sharks played during these playoffs. Only Game 5 against the Blues competes with those 3 games for worst Sharks games of the playoffs, and Vlasic was not there for those 3. He was such a key part in being able to shut down players like Nathan MacKinnon, that line in general, like whatever the Golden Knights could throw at the Sharks. And playing with Brent Burns, that was the Sharks' best defensive unit. Vlasic was taking on some pretty solid minutes considering the fact that Joakim Ryan couldn't play anything really, and he was so good in that role so many times. For all the other defensemen like Burns, Carlson, I can think of moments during the playoffs where they made massive mistakes in the defensive zone. Burns, multiple giveaways. Carlson, multiple giveaways. Dillon, multiple giveaways. Braun, multiple mistakes. But with Vlasic, I'm even struggling to think of a specific play or two or specific goal or two that really had a Vlasic misplay in them. Obviously, there probably were plays, but they're struggling to come to mind. And as such, Vlasic gets the best grade on this board with an A. And in fact, Vlasic was actually extremely close to getting an A+. I just didn't feel right giving Couture an A and then Vlasic an A+, considering Couture obviously also had a fantastic postseason. But Vlasic was very, very close to being MVP for me for the Sharks in this Sharks run of trying to get to the Cup Finals. Next is Joakim Ryan, and in a similar vein as Michael Haley, it's a bit difficult to rate Joakim Ryan because obviously the majority of his terrible play came at the end of this regular season. But so coming into the playoffs, DeBoer, obviously rightfully so, only felt like trusting Ryan with a few minutes per game. I mean, he got as low as like 3 minutes and 18 seconds in games. Even in long overtimes against the Golden Knights, I don't think he had the double-digit number in either of those 2 games. So Ryan was not trusted on playing big minutes because of the fact that he was so terrible down the stretch. But in the playoffs, in the few minutes he did get per game, he really wasn't all that bad. So the main criticism of Ryan comes from the fact that he wasn't a good enough sixth defenseman to be trusted, not necessarily because during the few minutes he did get, he was completely terrible. So his grade is not going to be, let's say, an F, because when he did get his few minutes, he was okay. He didn't make too many glaring defensive mistakes. Obviously, had a few bad shifts here or there, but all in all, it wasn't awful. So he'll still get a bad grade, but not as bad as, say, Brendan Dillon, and he'll get a C-. Next is Justin Braun, whose playoffs were okay. Braun was the only defender here who didn't have a consistent partner, I guess would be the way to put it, because of the fact that the Sharks were basically completely overloaded on right-handed defensemen, since Joakim Ryan was a left-hander who didn't play more than a few minutes, so the Sharks had 5D going, and they had Burns and Vlasic, who were almost always together for main shifts, and then Carlson and Dillon were a group, but playing Carlson with Braun as two right-handers was a bit awkward, so Braun was sort of the odd man out at times, got a few shifts with Vlasic here or there, occasionally played with Carlson or Burns, and Braun was okay, didn't contribute much of anything offensively, had some defensive mistakes here or there, so it was a pretty uninspired playoffs from Justin Braun, sort of like his regular season, really. He wasn't a liability most of the time during the regular season, but he also wasn't making a huge difference, right? He was not even close to Vlasic's level of defensive play during these playoffs, and as such, Braun gets an okay grade, but I felt like it would be weird to give him too much more than a C+. Next is Erik Carlson, and Erik Carlson played just about every game of the playoffs except Game 6 against the Blues, and he didn't play most of Game 5 against the Blues. And Carlson ended up with 16 points over the, 18 or so games that he did actually end up playing, so very impressive. And the fact that most of those points came spread out over the games instead of having them concentrated in just a few of them, like Brent Burns, as I will say when I get to him. So Erik Carlson was more of a consistent offensive force than Brent Burns, who was more of like a dominant offensive force, but just in a few games here or there, so that was nice to see. But Carlson also had a tendency to, misplay with pucks, obviously due to his injury. There were times where he would try to overcompensate, so sometimes he'd give the puck away in his own zone, and then he'd try really hard to try and get it back, which would put him even further out of position. So for instance, I believe it was Game 4 or it was Game 5 against the St. Louis Blues, I think it was Game 5 actually, where he gives the puck away to Sundqvist, then immediately tries to go to the front of the net to block the shot, but he ends up just screening Martin Jones and the puck goes in. So there were misplays from Erik Carlson, but you can't discount the offense. At times, I would say in the last 3 games of the Golden Knights series and the first 5 games of the Avalanche series, so like the middle of these playoffs, Carlson looked better. He was getting beat less defensively. He was still making good offensive plays. So all in all, a pretty solid playoffs for Erik Carlson, discounting the fact that he had the injury, and as such, he gets the grade of a B+. Now, Brent Burns had an interesting playoffs. He had 83 points through 82 games during the regular season, and he ends up putting 16 points up in 20 games in these playoffs. So obviously quite impressive to be at a 0.8 per game, points per game pace. However, I specified with Carlson that his offense was more split across multiple games, while Brent Burns was mostly concentrated in specific games. So for instance, the first 2 games against the Avalanche, he had 7 points, and that means he only had 9 points through the other 18 games, which is a 0.5 point per game pace, which for Brent Burns isn't great. And you also can just look at the fact that he had 10 points through the entire series against the Avalanche, meaning he only had 6 points through the 13 games against both the Golden Knights and the Blues. So Brent Burns, there were obviously a few games where he was just so strong. That Game 1 against the Avalanche obviously comes to mind, but there were too many games where Burns really wasn't having much of an offensive impact. The good news for Brent Burns is that he actually played a solid defensively for a good chunk of these playoffs. It probably benefits from the fact that he was playing with Vlasic for really almost the first time that he's been a San Jose Shark, while Vlasic and Carlson as a pairing never really worked out. This Vlasic-Burns pairing was a lot better than that Vlasic-Carlson pairing, and so Burns certainly benefiting from number 44, but also playing pretty decently himself. Still the usual giveaways, which in the playoffs are exacerbated as they are, potentially a lot more punishing. But it was still pretty decent playoffs. Burns was also required to play tons and tons of minutes. I believe he was the highest ice time forward by the end of the 3rd round. A good chunk more ice time than even the next closest player, as in overtimes he was playing like 30 minutes plus. 40 minutes plus, I believe, came for him in Game 6 against the Golden Knights because of the double overtime. In regulation, he never got less than 23 minutes in even a specific game, and those include games where the Sharks either had a massive lead or a massive deficit. So Burns was asked to play a lot, and he actually lived up rather well to that role, so he'll get a similar grade to Carlson with a B+. Next and finally is Martin Jones. I don't have Aaron Dell on the board because he only made a couple of appearances in games 2 and 4 in relief for Martin Jones, so I didn't really feel the need to evaluate him. And Jones is a difficult one because his playoffs were so extremely up and down. I mean, if I was just evaluating the first 4 games of the postseason for Jones, games 1 to 4 for the Golden Knights, against the Golden Knights, it would probably be a grade of about a D, maybe even a D-. If I was then just evaluating from game 5 against the Golden Knights all the way to the end of the Colorado series, Jones could very well get like an A-, maybe even an A. And if I was just evaluating the St. Louis Blues series, he'd probably get somewhere around a C+. But all together, Jones actually had a pretty solid postseason. He wasn't elite. He wasn't like Tuukka Rask level for the Bruins where he's going to be up in an A or even close to an A+. But he also wasn't the reason the Sharks were eliminated. As I said in my 5 reasons the Sharks were eliminated video, Jones was not on that list because he was mostly strong. So even though he sort of fell off a bit in that St. Louis Blues series, so did the Sharks defense, especially in the latter half of it. So Jones, all in all, if you maybe count the first 4 games of the postseason as maybe a small hiccup, all in all played rather well. And as such, he does still get the grade of a B. That was quite close to a B-. I feel like maybe if you count all 20 games as equal, you could definitely get away with saying a B-. But I'm taking a bit out of those first 4 games, especially the first game where he did technically still win, even if he looked shaky. And so I'll still be a bit more hyped up about Martin Jones's play in these playoffs by giving him a B. But that will do it for these grades. Disappointing to see players like Brendan Dillon and especially Joakim Ryan, but especially Brendan Dillon, somewhat disappoint during these playoffs. It would have been nice if Ryan could have actually been good during this season so that he could replace Radim Šimek when he went down for an injury. Also disappointing, of course, to see Erik Carlson get injured for the entirety of the last playoffs, but it was nice to see that a pairing of Vlasic-Burns actually worked extremely well, and that Vlasic was able to recover from an inconsistent regular season, and hopefully he'll actually be able to bring that into the next year. Class dismissed.